Hey, good morning. Welcome in this session, AZ is not that easy, or better explained, what has changed in the new Azure certification. My name is Peter Tanner. I am a CEO and lead technical trainer at a company I started about 9 years ago called PDTIT, but branding our Azure training offering out of 007 FFF Learning. I've been working in IT a bit more than 20 years, and initially had a pretty focused background on Exchange and everything around Exchange, from building data centers, deploying servers, Hyper-V, VMware, everything around security, firewalling. But about 5 years ago, decided to step away from Exchange and totally focus on Azure. And that's what I've been doing for the last 5 years, traveling pretty much all over the world, providing Azure readiness workshops to larger Microsoft partners, larger Microsoft customers, and Microsoft internal. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer for a bit more than 10 years and an Azure MVP for 5 years. When I'm not delivering training or providing consulting, I keep myself still in the Azure environment by writing, authoring books for Apress, creating training videos for Pact Publishing, Microsoft, and a couple of other learning partners. If you want to stay in touch during the session or afterwards, my tweet handles are PDTIT and 007 FFF Learning, or shoot me an email, peter@pdtit.be. The session objectives for today are pretty easy, starting with the new Azure exam overview, walking you through the different certification path, where to find study material, which might be one of the most important topics here, and wrapping up the session with my personal road to success, tips and tricks from the Microsoft trainer. So let me start with the new Azure exam overview. Now, when we look at the Azure exams that have been around for about 5-6 years, it was actually pretty straightforward. Developing Azure solutions was obviously mainly targeted towards developers, known as the 7532. If you were like an IT pro, more like a technical hands-on guy, then the 533 implementing Azure solutions was the way to go. And if you wanted to step a little bit away from like the deep dive hands-on, or you moved up within your organization to a solution architect, then the 7534 that got replaced by the 535 last year, January, or beginning this year better, 2018, then was the architecting Azure solutions. And then mapping it with the Microsoft certified credentials, you could recognize the Microsoft certified developer, the certified solution associate, and the certified solution expert. But all that is pretty much gone. Why? Because each and every of those 3 exams were too much focused on features, like really testing you how to do something. Why would you use this kind of Azure service whatsoever? But even more important, they were too much outdated. It's a little bit internal Microsoft, but the way Microsoft Learning has been developing certification, has been developing readiness material, like providing the Microsoft official courseware, it was not really catching up with the fast pace of cloud changes. So it could happen that at any point in time you were taking a training at one of the so many learning partners, finding out that the training material was 3 to sometimes 4 or more months outdated. Or when the training material is somehow up to date, it might still happen that the actual hands-on labs were a little bit outdated. So there was a lot of struggling and not really mapping with the new, I would say, cool, shiny, fast pace of the Azure environment. Another reason why they wanted to step away from these exams is because there was a lot of overlap. So although they called it developing Azure solutions, it was about 40% testing the candidates on Azure infrastructure, or like the implementing Azure solutions was covering IaaS and PaaS, where out of the field, it's in a lot of scenarios that the PaaS environments like serverless, microservices, web apps, logic apps, functions is mainly used by developers and not really used by IT pro audience. So with that, all these certifications are becoming retired as of the end of this year, December 31st. Now, don't worry too much if you're already in the studying process for any of those exams, because it's still about the same Azure environment. So you're not really losing the time and effort you already spent on it. So what's more important for this session is everything that's new. The most important change that I didn't talk about yet is that it's not based on features and services anymore, but it's really based on a job role. So Microsoft Learning spent a lot of time and organized a lot of internal workshops, and I was part of several of those, where instead of focusing on the different Azure services and features, we started from what would be the typical job role content, like what are the typical job tasks that an Azure admin would do on a day-to-day basis, or like a monthly basis if you want. If you are an Azure developer, then these are the specific Azure components that you really need to master. So totally flipping over from this is Azure, we got tons and tons of services and features, how to implement them and why to use them, but starting from if your job role is an Azure admin, what are the services that you're touching on a day-to-day basis, once a week, once a month, and so on. So starting from the job role. Next to that, instead of one single exam, it moved up to 2 exams per job role. Why? Because for each and every of those job roles, there's a lot of stuff in the Azure environment. And testing everything in one single exam became a little bit too hard. More important, will be kept current continuously. So Microsoft Learning made a lot of changes in their internal processing, guaranteeing that every 2 to 3 months, so pretty much every quarter, the exams will be updated and totally be in line with the latest changes in the Azure platform. And most important, again, better alignment with your Azure core components and how they map with your job role. Good. So moving on a little bit, like what is the Microsoft Learning certification path? So first of all, overall exam basics. Maybe some of you have never done any Microsoft exam in the past. My first exam was in the mid-90s when I started my IT career. And even there, a lot has changed in the meantime. So in short, any exam, so not specifically mapped to Azure in the next 2 slides, but overall, any Microsoft exam is about 40 to 60 questions. It might be that you take one exam, it's 40 questions. The week after you take another exam and it's maybe 55 questions. So it's just based on a pool of questions. Where some of the questions, so each question technically gets a certain amount of points. It's not based on the initial questions you get. So whenever you already took an exam, then you might remember that they always start with how much experience do you have with, I don't know, Azure networking? How much experience do you have with Azure identity? Where some candidates think that those questions are used to actually build up the pool, but that already happened before. So it's more for Microsoft Learning to find out, like, when are people taking exams? All the way at the beginning when they know the platform, or is it after 18 months, maybe after more than 2 years, when they really think like, I mastered the platform. Timing wise, you get 180 minutes. So the technical exam is 150. And next to that, they calculate about 30 minutes for the pre-exam instructions. After the exam, you can provide feedback, comments, creating the report, and so on. So when you plan your exam, it's about 3 hours in total. Now, again, if you already have experience with the platform, you probably don't really need the 2.5 hours to complete the exam. The questions itself is always multiple choice. So they provide you a question and they give you multiple choice answers. And most important, read your questions. It might be that at some point in time, a question says, mark the 3 different options. If you don't know that you need to mark the 3 of them, then obviously you're going to fail that question. Or another question style is drag and drop, where they provide you a list of possible solutions, and you need to move them to the right-hand side of the screen in the correct order. Like, how would you deploy site-to-site VPN gateway in Azure? And giving you the 7 steps, and you have to move them in the correct order. Or mapping with certain different scenarios. Now, one of the bigger changes specifically for the new Azure exams is performance-based. Performance-based means that they're going to ask you to actually do something on the exam. So they will provide you a live Azure environment, giving you a certain scenario like deploying a virtual machine, Windows machine, Linux machine, in different subnets, in the same VNet, configuring firewalls and whatnot. And you have to do it in the live Azure exam. If you're taking the 300 one, so the architect one, you still get access to an live Azure environment where certain topics, certain resources are already being deployed. And based on that, you get a list of questions, but you don't have to do anything inside that environment. And by the way, how you do it using the portal PowerShell CLI, that's up to you. Some other questions style, the last one is case studies, where they provide you a detailed information about business and technical requirements, where you need to drill down, distill the exact information, and obviously, again, finding the correct answer specifically to that case study. So those are a little bit harder because it's not just testing you on how to deploy a virtual network, but it might be that they're going to ask you like, what's the IP subnetting range that you're going to define based on technical requirement, where any VNet or subnet should not allow you to deploy more than 50 IP resources. I don't know, just guessing from the top of my head here. And then another point of discussion, questions that might come up is around the exam scoring. So every Microsoft exam asks you to pass with a scoring of 700, which somehow doesn't really reflect 70% out of the 100%. So it's a cut score, and you need 700. Some questions might be 1 point, couple of points, and some of them might not give you any points at all. That's again based out of the pool between the 40 and the 60. So the cut score is determined during the exam development. So everything happens out of Microsoft Learning upfront, where again with a team of subject matter experts like myself, they go through each and every question. Sometimes we can also assist in actually building questions and then defining like what's the scoring metric for that specific question. Now again, you don't get any points if part of the question is wrong. Like if you need to provide 3 answers, I know you only provide 1 or 2, then obviously you don't get any scorings for that. Some questions cannot be skipped, which is another angle in the exam. So in most scenarios, you can skip questions, and all the way at the end, you can review them. Now, if you have a specific case study scenario, then you need to answer those questions. You move to the next one, and then you cannot go back to that case study. Alrighty, so back to the specific Azure certifications, which again is the core topic of the session today. So think back about the old one, developing Azure solutions, implementing and architecting. It's totally changed now. An Azure administrator, Azure developer, Azure solutions architect. Another one that's been announced is the Azure DevOps engineer. There might come up other ones like a data engineer, an Azure security engineer, and probably a lot more in the next coming months. So already talked about it, that for each and every of those, it's now separated out in 2 different exams. So the Azure admin is the AZ 100 and 101. Developer is the 200, 201, architect 300 and 301. But next to that, you also have what's called the transitioning exams. So for example, if you already have your Azure administrator, the 7533, then you don't need to retake the 2 100 and 101, but instead taking the 102. So you already need to have any of the 3 previous ones I talked about, and you can transition to the newer one. Now important, it's not an upgrade exam. They explicitly call it a transitioning exam because you're mainly being tested on everything that was not part of that legacy exam, if you want. And by the way, the developer, architect, and DevOps engineer are currently in beta, but already knowing that the older ones will retire by the end of this year, most probably those exams will go fully live in the next couple of weeks. So the way you look at the typical, I would say, certification path, it starts with the fundamentals. So yes, there is an Azure Certified Fundamentals credential, where honestly, if you're already using Azure a little bit, then that's probably a bit too easy. And that's why we call it optional, meaning you don't have to start with that credential. So if you've been working in the IT field for like, let's say 2 years or longer, obviously, then based on, again, your job role, you're going to decide if you want to go for the Azure Admin Associate, Developer Associate, and again, later on, probably other ones coming up, like the Security Engineer, Data Engineer, and who knows whatever comes up in the next couple of months. Or, and this is again another change, you can immediately start with the Architect Expert level. So it's not like before, where if you wanted to become an Azure Certified Architect, you also needed to take the 533 or 532, and then moving up to the 535. So now you can just pick any of those certification credentials as a standalone certification. And then again, the remark on the side about the transitioning exams. If you already have the 532 credential today, you can take the AZ202. If you have the 533, you would take the AZ102. And if you have the 535, then you could move up by taking the AZ302. So actually pretty straightforward certification path. So the next couple of slides, what I want to talk about is, what do I need to know for each and every exam? Now, I'm not going to dive into all the details, but what I'm going to do is showing you where you can actually find all the details yourself. Now, in short, the AZ100, Azure Infrastructure and Deployment, is really about Azure infrastructure. So important in there is understanding Azure subscriptions and resources. How do you manage them? What about policies? What about resource groups? That kind of questions. And then drilling down on Azure Storage, Azure Virtual Machines, Virtual Network, and a little bit on identities. Now, for each and every of those keywords, topics, you can see there's a certain metric. And that really points to the weight on the exam. So Azure subscriptions, resources, roughly 15%, identities 15%, and everything else is 20 to 25%, which means out of the 40 to 60 questions, knowing that storage, VMs, and networking maps with about 25%, it means that between 10 and 12 questions on each and every of those topics will show up on the exam. I'll point you to the link and do a quick demo if you want a walkthrough in the Microsoft Learning web portal. But first, drilling down on some other details for each and every of those 6 Azure exams for now. So the second one for the Azure Administrator is the 101, Azure Integration and Security. So it's a little bit away from the previous topics, where it's not a how to deploy a virtual machine, but for example, in the first part, how to migrate to Azure, which is possible in a couple of different ways, and that's what you're going to be tested on. The next one is implementing managing application services. So think about how to deploy, how to manage web apps, logic apps, knowing a little bit about containers, and advanced virtual networking, which if I'll show you the details, it's pointing to site-to-site VPN, express route, user-defined routing, so load balancers are also in there. So it's a bit more in-depth and not just the basic VNet, subnet configurations. And then identity comes back, where this weight is about 25 to 30%. So it's a little bit more in-depth on managing Azure Active Directory. So let me jump to the Microsoft Learning portal, where you can find all that information. So the landing page here is microsoft.com/learning, and this is where you end up, where you can see that obviously they're promoting the new Azure Learning Pads quite heavily. But besides that, you can find all information regarding Microsoft certification, Microsoft exams, Microsoft training from this landing page. So it's not just the Azure Learning Portal, it's really about Office 365, Configuration Manager, Server 2016, 2019, and everything else you can find in there. So from here, you can obviously just click around and browsing, finding the information you're looking for. And let's say I'm interested in the role-based certifications. It's providing some guidelines, and up here you can find the new ones. So since I was talking about the certified Azure admin, let's continue with that specific path. So what it's going to show you is where you can find learning material. I'll talk about that in a minute. And also how to take a practice test. There are certain third-party vendors providing you official Microsoft Learning validated practice tests and the actual live exam scheduling. More important, drilling down on what do I need to know. So for that, there's another link. Up here, where it's actually pointing to the microsoft.com/learning/exam-az- with the number of the exam. So for the 200s and the 300s, I'll talk about in the next couple of minutes, it's exactly the same scenario. So from here, and that's what I actually wanted to show you, is that it's always pointing to the measured skills, really meaning this is what you need to know for the exam. So whenever you start in your certification journey, if you want, my recommendation is always start from this landing page because that's the most up-to-date official Microsoft Learning information. So if I point you at the different topics I covered in the last couple of slides I was talking about, so really the highlights, it's literally taken over from here. So when I was talking about the server migration, technically what you need to know is Azure Migrate. So there's a specific tool helping you in migrating lift and shift migrations to Azure, or using Azure Site Recovery, understanding P2V migrations, how to configure storage for virtual machine migration, and so on. So in short, the high-level objective is understanding server migration, knowing how to do it by drilling down on Azure Migrate and Azure Site Recovery. So if you're preparing for your exam, what you got to do is creating an Azure subscription, and I'll show you in the next few minutes how Azure Learning can help you there. And mastering Azure Migrate, you install it, you deploy it, you test it out, and next to that, you're going to build Azure Site Recovery, implementing it, knowing the dependencies, understanding a little bit on PowerShell, maybe CLI, or the portal on how to actually configure Site Recovery and migrate your workloads. That's how you can prepare. Or the other one, virtual networking. So let me highlight this for a second. So what it's testing you on is not VNets, subnets, but it's talking about implementing load balancing, understanding the different load balancing solutions, using Network Watcher to perform monitoring and network management, and lastly, integrating with other Azure VNets like site-to-site connectivity, VNet peering, and ExpressRoute. And again, that's really how to find what do you need to know for that exam. So moving on, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, but most important is that you know where to find it and how you have to understand each and every topic. But in short, for the 200 exam, the Azure Developer Core Solutions, it starts with selecting the appropriate cloud technology. Technically, balancing between should I deploy IaaS or PaaS and understanding the differences and dependencies. Developing cloud storage. It's not just about different storage solutions, but mainly about storage security. How do I make sure as a developer that my application can connect to storage, like using blob storage? And how can I secure that only my application can connect to it and not the rest of the world? Just an example. Creating platform as a service solutions. Web apps, logic apps, functions, SQL PaaS. That's what's been covered in here. And lastly, overall cloud solution security. With the second exam for the Azure developer is testing you on advanced solutions. Pretty similar in topics, but focusing on cloud integration, like really combining different Azure workloads together, and focusing as well on the cognitive services, bots, and IoT solutions. So that's really specific for the 201 exam. And again, for each and one of them, I provide you the link pointing to the Microsoft Learning website where you can find all the details, the core objective domains for each and every of those items. And then two last slides in this section, the Azure Architect technologies, again, based on two different exams, the AZ300 and the 301, where most important in the 300, it's not really testing you on how to do it. So you don't really need to know any PowerShell scripts, CLI comment, or even knowing in the portal how to do it, but it's more about designing phase. and that's really being emphasized in the 301, where you can see that for pretty much each and every large component in the platform, workloads, identity, security, data platform, business continuity like Azure Backup, Site Recovery. It's not about how to do it, but it's really about what are the core Azure services that you're going to use to allow business continuity, high availability, things like traffic manager in a design concept, and so on and so on. And again, most important, know the different exams, understand the core topics. There might be services and features in the Azure platform that are somehow mapping with any of the core objectives, but they might not be an exam objective. And then, obviously it's not just about the exam. I wouldn't even say you don't need to know them or even understand them, because the week after taking your exam, you're still an Azure architect. So it's not about just the test and done. Cool. So the next thing is, where do I get started? I'm working with Azure and I want to take my certification. What do I need to know, and where can I find additional study material? So first of all, obviously, training and certification. You can do micro-learning on your own, and I'll show you in a minute what Microsoft provides there. You can use online courses from a lot of different vendors, and you might remember out of my personal introduction what we do as a business, and providing instructor-led training. So a lot of different options. Some of them, as you can see here in the middle section, is sponsored by Microsoft Learning partners like ourselves, LinkedIn Learning, which is an online resource, Pluralsight, Upskility, Pact, Udemy, A-Cloud, and obviously a lot of other ones. So it's really up to you. Maybe your company has a learning agreement with a learning partner, or if you're a larger Microsoft customer, you might have some learning benefits like a free Pluralsight subscriptions for Azure Learning, or maybe getting discounted training at a silver or gold learning partner. So you got a lot of options there. Now going back to the micro learning, like really learning in your own pace, is a new offering that was announced during Microsoft Ignite at the end of September. So like 2 months ago. It's called Microsoft Learn. Now what is Microsoft Learn? It's a free website. So the URL there is microsoft.com/learn, where you can start and go through a lot of different learning paths. Or even better is not just learning about it, like going through all the theoretical approach, watching video-based training, but also performing hands-on learning, where you can actually spin up a free Azure subscription, so you don't need to have a subscription yourself, and taking it from there. So let me do 2 quick walkthrough demos here to just give you some kind of experience what it looks like. So from the microsoft.com/learn, you start with your job role. So if I'm an Azure admin, what it's going to do is filtering about all the training content that's available for now and providing what specific reflecting my job role. So maybe I'm responsible for, let's say, administering infrastructure resources. So it's about 8 hours in content, as you can see up here, close to 8 hours that you need to invest in really learning, and based on 8 different modules. So they're going to start with virtual machines, introduction, building a checklist, creating a VM, describing additional options, and so on. Then the next part is creating Linux VM, creating a Windows VM, managing VMs using CLI, and so on and so on. So for each and one of them, you just start your learning path, and it's going to walk you to theoretical information where you can read through, and moving on with some online video training. Up here, I'm not going to start it, but I'm pretty sure you get what I want to talk about here. So that's really your learning journey. You start from the microsoft.com/learn, select whatever you want, and that's how you go through it. The second aspect is the actual live learning. So if I go back to the Learn homepage, and this time selecting hands-on learning, it looks pretty similar, but it's giving you hands-on integrations, like learning, Azure fundamentals, why not? Where you can start with an introduction, what is Azure, how to create a VM, and you're going to start it. So from here, and again, depending a bit on the selections you make, but one of them that I had ready is creating a SQL database and focusing on security. So up here. So what it's going to do is setting up a sandbox environment. So it's going to create a free, again, you don't need any credit card whatsoever. It's going to spin up an Azure environment and allowing you to log on, where this one is based on Cloud Shell. So in the backend, it's going to provide an Azure subscription, giving you full owner access rights. And later down here, it's going to ask you to just execute, in this scenario, execute a certain set of commandlets to actually log on to your Azure environment and securing your database. So it's not just a technical, theoretical approach, but also helping you in hands-on environments where you don't need to provide any Azure credentials or any Azure subscription yourself. So that's pretty intuitive. And the last part here is another sample that I just selected here, where I'm going to learn about role-based access control. So what I do, if I'm open up the lab environment here, what it did is providing me a live Azure portal where I can see a lot of stuff, but in there, it's also, that's second tab. Sorry for the browsing here a little bit, but that's just how it's being deployed. So what it does when I start that lab is providing me a lab guide and really describing what you need to do. So from the upper right corner of the Azure portal, click your username, go to My Permissions, and so on and so on. So you can do this and selecting your permissions and so on and so on. So it's really hands-on, and again, it's not relying on your corporate subscription. And in short, that's the Microsoft Learn, the new offering out of Microsoft, free training resources, theoretical presentations, video-based, and the hands-on lab backends. As a wrap-up, additional resources. I talked about the Microsoft Learn, talked about other training centers, learning partners like ourselves that you can use, or checking back on the Microsoft.com learning landing page, where for each and every of the AZ- numbers, you can find the detailed information. Next to that, practice tests. It's a third-party external company providing official Microsoft Learning certified practice tests where you can go through an exam simulation, providing you 100-something questions. But next to giving you the questions, it's also providing you some guidelines, some descriptions why that answer is correct or not correct. And then one of the other important training resources is the official Microsoft Docs Azure documentation, obviously. So the learning paths is important, hands-on learning, which is a really nifty feature if you ask me, providing you additional learning material. And at the end of each lab that you start, every learn snippet, it's also going to ask you to answer questions out of a knowledge check. And the funny thing about it is that you can get certain points, and maybe some organizations, like maybe you remember the Microsoft Virtual Academy in the past, it's still there, but it's not providing you the latest Azure learning material. But what I did when I was still working for a partner at that time was organizing a monthly competition with our consultants where they could go to the learning platform at their own pace. And at the end of the month, the person who spends most time and got the best ranking could win a gift card or something. So pretty fun side effect and still pushing people in learning Azure. So for the last couple of minutes, let me share my, I would say, personal tips and tricks in the road to success. It's based on numbers. So what I do in each and every training delivery where people ask me questions about certification is, in short, walking them through a similar deck that I built for this session. But the most important one is these numbers. 30, 60, 90. What it means is, from today, whenever you watch this session, you're interested in taking Azure certification, you set a goal that in 90 days from when you're watching this session, that's when you're going to take your exam. That gives you 30 days in between to learn. The first 30 days, you're going to absorb as much information as possible. In the next 30 days, you're going to play with the hands-on labs. And in the last 30 days, you're going to focus on everything that you didn't really understand that well. And then the 1 and 2, the 1 is during the 30, 60, 90, you spend 1 hour a day, every day, including weekdays, including weekends, 1 day on learning Azure. Can be deploying something, can be watching an Ignite session. They're all published on YouTube. Maybe talking with a colleague, reaching out to community folks like myself, like, hey, Peter, I'm struggling with deploying containers in Azure. Can we book a 1 hour slot? Yeah, sure, why not? Maybe I just point you to a video training that I built on it. Or I might send you some links to Azure documentation where you can go through your lunchtime and just reading about a subject. That's the 1 hour a day. And the 2 is later towards the end of your 90-day window, you're going to move it up to 2 hours because you really need to focus on understanding, mastering the exam objectives. And the other angle for the 2 is everybody can fail. I don't know how many exams I tried, but yes, I fail exams. Actually, even Azure exams. I'm not really a developer. I'm into the DevOps concept more and more, but 5 years ago when I started working with Azure, I relied on my infrastructure knowledge, and I was pretty bad in everything that was developer oriented. So I needed even more than 2 retakes for passing my developer exam. So that's, in short, my giveaway tips and tricks. 30, 60, 90 days, a 1 hour a day during 90 days, and 2 hours more towards the end. And if everything else fails, you just rebook your exam and you try again. And even more important with the 2 is that for each and every Azure job role today, you have 2 exams instead of the 1 in the old model. So with that, I'm going to close down this presentation. So what you learned in this session is the different new Azure exams, the different certification path, where can you find study material, and wrapped it up with my personal tips and tricks. I would like to thank you for having been in my session. And again, feel free to stay in touch by email peter@pdtit.be or on the Twitter social media platform. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.